Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to have you here. We are very happy, Joyce, Beth, and I, to welcome you again for the second day of our round of conversations on internationalization. We had the first round of debates and presentations yesterday, which was very fruitful and very rich in terms of the contributions we've made. And today we have the second part of our talk. Before we go on to call the authors of the special issue of the ETD journal called Internationalization in Higher Education, Assumptions, Meaning, and Impacts, I just would like to say that this is the idea of this event is to present the issues published in the special issue organized by Joyce and I. And part of this organization and the work of this issue is related to Joyce's postdoc project at UFES, okay? So we're very happy to have you here. In the end, Joyce and Beth will also talk a little bit about the organization. But without further ado, we would like to call our first guest today, Professor Hans de Wit from the University of Boston College, the USA. And let's see where Professor... So, Professor Hans, it is a pleasure, an honor, and a privilege to have you here. We're very happy. And we just would like to remind the viewers and the audience that though all the presentations will be in English, you're more than welcome to make comments and questions both in English and in Portuguese. But in the case of Professor Hans de Wit, he won't be able to stay until the end for the debate, but we'll make our best to send Professor Hans de Wit the comments and questions to his presentation, okay? So Professor Hans, thank you very much again for being part of this, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, thank you not only for inviting me to this event, and I'm sorry I cannot stay longer. There was an unforeseen circumstance that forces me after the first two presentations to leave. But also want to thank you for organizing this special issue of the ETD on internationalization, higher education, assumptions, meanings, and impacts. I've been reading also the other contributions, and I think it has been a very relevant and important contribution to the discourse about internationalization of higher education. And so it was a great pleasure for me to participate in that special issue, not only with my own paper, which I'm briefly going to summarize, but also in the second paper that will be presented by Fernanda Leal about the issue of refugees in higher education in the Brazilian context. 15 minutes is not easy to address the future of internationalization in challenging global context. In particular, not keeping in mind that I wrote the paper before really the pandemic started to affect higher education. So I will make some reference at the end also to what are the implications for the future of the pandemic on internationalization of higher education. But briefly, first give the context where we start from. Next slide, please. Internationalization seems now to be quite natural in higher education around the world. Everybody talks about it. It is part of institutional strategies in most universities around the world. National governments have strategies. International organizations like UNESCO and OECD and the World Bank talk about internationalization of higher education. So it seems to be that it's always been there, but as a strategic concept, it is pretty new. It was only in the late 1980s, beginning of the 1990s, that really, as a result of globalization of our societies and the fall of the Iron Curtain in Europe and the new geopolitical context related to that, that this whole phenomenon of internationalization came to the forefront. Before that, it was very fragmented, it was marginal, and also important in the discourse, it was a very Western approach to internationalization that was present. But it became more important and now is very present, but still it is a very varied phenomenon. And when you ask people, what do we mean with internationalization? in different parts of the world, in different types of institutions, by different stakeholders, you get a big variety of answers. And that's because there's a dynamic combination of political motivations for internationalization, economic factors, social cultural factors, and academic factors that influence why internationalization is important for students, for faculty, for institutional leaders, and for national leaders in the different type of context. So internationalization is quite different when we talk about Brazil in compared to Colombia, when we talk about Boston College in compared to Harvard University, which are just neighboring countries and neighboring institutions. It's different when you talk about internationalization, even in disciplines. It's different in engineering, that's in education, or in economics sciences. So internationalization is that broad that there's not a single model that fits all. You always have to look at the specific time in which it is placed, the specific context, both geographically and institutional, in which it is placed, to understand why we are internationalizing, how we are doing it, what we are doing, and what the impact and the outcome is doing. So that's very important to keep in mind. Next slide, please. But what we see indeed, as I mentioned, there's a growing importance of internationalization now at all levels. And what we also see, and that is a challenging fact that we have to keep in mind, that over the past decades, internationalization has become much more part of the whole privatization process of higher education and much more focused on revenue generation, in particular in the key Anglophone and Western European countries, United States, United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, continental Europe, etc. And that has been driving very much the internationalization process in those countries, with a result of negative impact on the developing countries as brain drain, etc. We also see that increasingly the pressures of globalization make that reputation becomes very important, that governments look for what are the best and brightest institutions in our countries that can compete with other institutions around the world. So global rankings have become a very important dimension of internationalization over the past decades. And in that, it has strengthened basically the Western Anglophone dominance in internationalization of higher education and in higher education in general. So we see a shift from what my colleague Mark van der Ven calls of paradigm from cooperation to more competition taking place. And in that, numbers are very important. Institutions want to have as much of international students, they want to send as much students abroad, they want to have as much partnerships around the world, they want to be the highest number in the rankings, they want to have the most funding for internationalization, etc. So quantity, also driven by revenue generation and rankings, is much more important now than when we talk about quality. And quality in the context of the institutional context. Quality in the sense of the relation to the mission of the own institution in the context that they are operating, which again is quite different if you talk about Unicamp to a small private university in Brazil, or if you talk to a University of Applied Sciences or a research university. And what we also see increasingly, and that is certainly the case now, is challenges between nationalist trends and increased internationalization. And the pandemic has really made that more manifest. On the one hand, the pandemic has shown how the impact of mobility is on higher education institutions, and the negative consequences it has on the possibilities to have mobility of students, mobility of faculty, both for mobility for degree programs and for credits. It also has an impact on the sense that on the one hand, there's more need for international research collaboration, but we also see that there are all kinds of competing forces in the political sense that make that international collaboration much more difficult. And that's one of the biggest challenges that we face in the current climate. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, what we see is a globalization of internationalization. It is still strongly dominated by the Western Anglophone and Anglo-Saxon world, but we see increasingly that internationalization becomes a strong factor in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, in Central Asia, in Central European countries, which were not so present in that whole arena, or were only on the sending side of students, depending on the Western world. Now we see that internationalization becomes really at the heart of institutions in, for instance, Brazil and the rest of Latin America. With all the challenges the pandemic creates, and nationalist tendencies also in Brazil have a negative impact on the internationalization strategy, I think in the current situation, we see by that as a result also opportunities. Opportunities because countries like Brazil are not so depending on revenue from international students. The numbers of international students are small, and if they are there, they are basically there for quality reasons. And so, not being dependent, the pandemic gives an opportunity to see, well, we are not having this enormous revenue loss that other institutions are facing. So we can focus on what is much more important, the internationalization at home, the internationalization of the curriculum, collaborative online international learning, etc. So there are challenges with the pandemic and with the increase in internationalist trends, but also opportunities. Next slide, please. So to summarize that, what we see is the competition and exclusive approach of internationalization driven by internationalization abroad, the mobility of students, the mobility of faculty, the short-term and long-term economic gains that countries like Australia and Germany, etc. want, the talent recruitment and brain drain issues to that, the rankings that are still driving, but at the same time, it is a very elitist and exclusive approach to internationalization. Only 1% to maximum 2% of the students and the faculty around the world profit from this whole competitive and reputation-driven agenda of internationalization. And so we have to focus the shift to a much more comprehensive approach to internationalization, where we focus on all students and all faculty, and on the local in the global context. So focusing on internationalization of the curriculum and learning outcomes to enhance the quality of education and research. That, I think, was already before the pandemic the key challenge that we need, but has made the pandemic much more to the forefront, that is where we have to see the future of internationalization. Next slide, please. So we discussed and already in 2015, so even before the pandemic, that we had to change that. So in a study for the European Parliament, we said internationalization of higher education has to be much more inclusive, has to be less elitist, cannot focus only on the 1 or 2% in the world. Mobility is still important. We will not exclude that. I myself have profited, like many others, from the possibility to have a period abroad. But as an isolated part, not integrated in a comprehensive strategy and internationalization of the curriculum, and not focusing on internationalization for all, it is staying to be exclusive and elitist. So we have to re-emphasize also that internationalization is not a goal in itself, but a means to enhance the quality of what we are doing in institutions. Research, education, and increasingly more important, also service to society. The third mission of the university, internationalization for society, as we call it. So the focus should not only be on economic rationales. And that's why, next slide, please, we have been updating the definition, in itself still an important working definition of J. Knight, to say that internationalization is the intentional process of integrating an international, intercultural, global dimension into the purpose, functions, and delivery of post-secondary education. But it has to be driven by a mission. And the mission is in order to enhance the quality of education and research for all students and staff, so not for that very small minority, and to make a meaningful contribution to society, to help the society to solve the sustainable development goals of the United Nations, to address poverty, to address climate change, to address healthcare, which is the pandemic, very clear. So that is what has to drive the agenda for internationalization of higher education for the future. Next slide, please. So there are clearly consequences, as I said, of the pandemic. But the pandemic only has manifested what already was happening before. A very elitism, as I mentioned, a very dominance of the Western Anglophone world in this. It had to deal with nationalism. It has to deal with geopolitical tensions, like the tensions between China and the United States, and China, Australia, etc. It has to deal with racism, with Black Lives Matter has become very manifesting that's also an issue in internationalization of higher education that we have to address. It has to deal with the focus too much on competition. It has to deal with rankings, etc. So all those challenges by the pandemic has become to the more forefront, and we have to address that. Next slide, and I'm trying to close it on, but the implications are very much clear. We have to make a shift. We cannot go back to the past. We also cannot think, like some people say, that the higher education sector will be completely radically revolutionized by the pandemic. That's absurd. Revolutions are never successful, as also conservative nationalism is never successful. But we have to change. And we have to work into a much more inclusive and responsible, sustainable internationalization. We have not digitalization replace higher education, but integrated by collaborative online learning in our curriculum and our teaching learning. So how can we make that shift? Is, I think, the key question for everybody who is convinced of the importance of internationalization of higher education. We have to make it more inclusive, we have to make it more responsible, and we have to make it sustainable. And in that, we can do much more, given the crisis, than we think we can do. Next slide. And I end with two quotes. One, which already Jay Knight and I wrote in 2018 in a book, and we said, as we look backwards and forwards, it's important to ask one question. What are the core principles and values underpinning internationalization of higher education that 10 or 20 years from now will make us look back and be proud of the track record and contribution that international higher education has made to the more interdependent world we live in, the next generation of citizens and the bottom billion people living in poverty in our planet? That has to drive the agenda for internationalization. And the second quote, next slide please, to end, was based on a paper that Betty Lisk, who is the real expert on internationalization of the curriculum, and I wrote in 2019, and we said, aligning the practice of internationalization with human values and the common global good requires that we first challenge some of our long-held views about what it is to be international as a university, as a teacher, a student, and a human being. And this requires us to pushing the boundaries of our own and others' thinking, focusing on people and ensuring that they develop and demonstrate the institutions' espoused human values. Those two quotes, in my view, reflect what is the future direction of how we can make the challenges of the current situation into opportunities to really make a significant contribution to society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hans. It's wonderful to hear you and to see that, I mean, you've been saying for more than 5 years, I think, actually long before the pandemic, the need to review and to think critically about what internationalization means. I think Sharon and others are going to give us some more insights about that. And for those of you who are watching this and who would like to maybe comment more and see more about this, you're welcome to read the articles in the journal. They're going to be appearing in the link before. And Hans, I agree with you when you say that the pandemic has shown us both challenges and opportunities. And I dare say that perhaps for the Global South, it has brought many more opportunities than challenges in terms of internationalization. And that is because, as you also said, we are not dependent on internationalization as a means of providing revenue for our universities. And so perhaps it is a time for us in the Global South to connect more with other partners in a more horizontal, balanced, sustainable, and responsible internationalization pattern, as I said, to actually make internationalization bring the best in terms of the common good and social justice. And I'm very happy to see that some of the issues we have in this journal, in this special issue in the journal, they address these changes and opportunities and challenges. So thank you very much. We're going to have now Fernanda presenting a paper that you wrote with her. So for the next paper, we have Hans and Fernanda, and also Lisa Unangst from the Boston College, who was not able to be here with us today. And so Fernanda will be presenting. And I thank you very much for your insights. And as I said, Hans, we'll make our best to send you the comments and questions later on, perhaps even through Fernanda. Okay? Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
So Fernanda, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kyria. Thank you, Hans. Thanks for everyone to be watching our presentation. I'm presenting on behalf of Professor Hans and Lisa. Our paper named Internationalization Aimed at Global Social Justice, Brazilian University Initiative to Integrate Refugees and Displaced Populations. You can go to the next slide. So the next slide, please. Thanks. So the purpose of this paper was to understand how initiatives focus on integrating refugees and displaced populations into Brazilian higher education and into Brazilian society more generally function, and how they dialogue with internationalization efforts. And the rationale for this study was the perception that internationalization has been immersed in a very competitive paradigm, as Professor Hans emphasized on his presentation, and that this calls for more cooperative forms to engage internationally and interculturally in initiatives that are explicitly aligned with broader social justice efforts. So we chose two Brazilian universities that are public and federal. They are located in southern Brazil, the Federal University of Santa Catarina and the Federal University of Paraná, because they have been working with the integration of these populations. And we use bibliographic resources, and we also conducted interviews with the key actors of these institutions. Next slide, please. So what we see in terms of internationalization is that there are two main trends. One of them is the evolution of the concept and the practice of internationalization. So it has been much more comprehensive, not only at the national level, but also at the institutional level. And there's also a greater recognition by everyone on the field that there are political and ethical issues that need to be addressed in terms of internationalization, despite the benefits of this process. So what we see in Brazil is that the historical preferences in terms of internationalization, they have shaped and they have restricted what internationalization is and also can be. So these have provided little space for initiatives on internationalization that are disconnected from the mainstream rationality or from the mainstream perceptions of internationalization. And this gives relevance to initiatives that are pursued by the institutions themselves. So we believe that this might shed light on how to better link work on internationalization with work on social justice. Next slide, please. So we argue that one of the issues that might be addressed through internationalization is the contemporary migratory crisis. And you can go to the next slide. Next slide, please. And what we see in Brazil is that there's no comprehensive policy for the integration of refugees or displaced populations into the Brazilian higher education. And this gives importance for the initiatives of individual universities, because we see that there's a law in Brazil from 1997 that says that refugees and asylum seekers, they have the right to access education in Brazil, including higher education. So there is no comprehensive policy on that. So the most important initiative is the one from ACNUR, Brazil, which is part of the United Nations, through the Cátedra Sérgio de Vieira Melo, an initiative that exists since 2003. And that universities might choose to participate. So today, there are 22 higher education institutions that are part of this cátedra that promotes teaching, research, and extension activities focused on refugees and displaced populations, including academic training of faculty and students in related topics, direct service, and advocacy for their rights and local integration. Next slide, please. Next slide. So describing these two institutions that we chose, no, you can go to the previous slide, please. So these are two public, tuition-free, multi-campus and research-based universities located in southern Brazil. And what our study demonstrated is that the work they do on integrating refugees and displaced populations has provided a valuable support for their protection and local integration. So here we listed the initiatives on those topics that those institutions promote. I'm not telling them now, but they're on the paper. And the second one, the Federal University of Paraná, has a more comprehensive program. They have many things in common, but the one in Paraná, the difference is that this program is more institutionalized. And because of that, now they are able to receive refugees as students too. So that's something that doesn't happen yet at UFSC. Next slide. So the results demonstrate first the importance of university autonomy, which has allowed the programs to evolve and to adapt to the contextual realities in which they belong, and also the partnerships with different actors. So these two things were very essential for the project to fulfill their intended purposes. This partnership has allowed the programs to have a very to integrate different perspectives and also people from different fields of knowledge, which is very important considering the complexity of the societal issue of migration. And we also observed a very active participation of undergraduate and graduate students as researchers and as volunteers of the program. And this is important considering that these days higher education is very focused on the integration of people at the global capitalist market, and this gives the students a more humanistic formation, allowing them to be better citizens. So we also observed that the programs promote a better integration among the university functions of teaching, research, and extension. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So the programs, they reinforce the social function of the university, and they place, you can go to the previous slide, please. Previous slide, please. So the programs, they reinforce the social function of the university, and they also place the university as a strategic actor that promotes the protection and integration of vulnerable populations. And we also observed on the dialogues of the people who were interviewed a very strong will to promote reciprocal dialogue between the university and the people involved. But there are many challenges that need to be addressed, especially in the case of the Federal University of Paraná, where they have refugees and displaced population as students. There's racism, xenophobia, learning and language difficulties that need to be addressed. We also observed a very low priority given to extension activities, and most of the activities that are developed by these programs, they are extension activities. So one of the interview coordinators say that doing extension is an act of faith, an act of courage, because teaching and research are the functions that count. That is, there's a whole structure that does not encourage you to do extension. So she was telling how hard it is to promote extension in a university when all when the whole structure is not contributing for that, when they're giving more value to the other functions of the university, especially research. And we also observed a weak articulation with the higher instances of the university. So it's hard for these projects to become truly institutional. They are much more related to initiatives of individual departments and faculties and students of the university, but not from the university itself. So the other interviewee said, sometimes we feel a little abused. We do everything, but they go to events and talk about the university, about what the university does to migrants, and we think, but what do they do to us in a daily basis? So we also observed a distancing between these projects and the current institutional internationalization policies in both universities. And these both universities, they are very well positioned in a national context. So we argue that these projects to integrate refugees and displaced populations, they might shed light on how to better link work on internationalization with work on social challenges that are both global and local. So the study emphasized the role of Brazilian higher education institutions' autonomy to develop internationalization strategies that are related to promoting global social justice, and also the importance of linking existing extension activities to institutional policies for internationalization, so that internationalization efforts do not suppress the more direct role of those institutions. So we argue finally that intentionality is a decisive factor for internationalization to fulfill its promises and to be truly linked to social justice efforts contributing to the transformation of reality in structural ways. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fernanda, very much.
I forgot to ask for the slides to go further. Sorry.
It's okay. Do you want to return to the slide? Do you still have?
No, it's done.
Okay. I was just thinking, Fernanda, while listening to you and linking with the previous talk by Hans de Wit, that among the many exclusions and imbalances promoted and enacted by internationalization, perhaps, and here we're talking about not only different countries in terms of geopolitical, geographical locations and political forces, languages, but also different areas, humanities versus STEM areas. And we can see in university, and as you brilliantly put in your paper, that there is also an imbalance in terms of research, extension, and teaching. Like your participant said, it really touched me when she said, doing outreach and extension is an act of faith, because what really matters is research and teaching, and perhaps not even research. If we consider that we are hired only to teach, and we do research and extension if we want, and at our own expense and intentions, because nothing is going to happen with us, at least in the system, in the higher education system in Brazil. So I agree that it is very necessary for us to discuss the role of different areas, and also extension research and teaching in university. And your paper has brilliantly shown two activities by UFSC and Federal do Paraná, which are achieving this. And I think this is exactly what we have to do. We have to show more of this. So thank you very much, and we'll return to this more in the end during the debate. Our next guests are going to be Sharon from University of British Columbia, Canada, and Jhuliane Silva from Universidade Federal do Paraná, the same university where Fernanda was describing the outreach activity that I mentioned. And I'm very happy to see that we're all aligned in this view of critical internationalization. So we're very happy to have you, Sharon and Jhuliane, here. And the floor is yours.
So, good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to thank Professor Joyce, Elizabeth, and Kyria, who organized this special issue and this live to promote our texts and the discussion on internationalization of higher education. I would also like to thank Sharon for the invitation to write and reflect on this theme with her. So the title of our paper is Challenges and Complexities of Decolonizing Internationalization in a Time of Global Crisis. And when Sharon and I talked about this presentation, we thought of reflecting on how we were currently wrestling with the themes that we addressed in the paper as an invitation for you all to read and respond to the ideas discussed. So to begin with, I myself was awarded 2 scholarships that somehow connected to internationalization initiatives in my academic life. One was after my master's degree with a Fulbright Foreign Language Teaching Assistant Scholarship to go to the United States in 2015. And another one was my visiting international research student at UBC in Canada last year, funded by Capesprete. At UBC, I attended a course Professor Vanessa Andriotti offered titled Paradoxes of Internationalization and Global Citizenship Education, in which I was able to engage in discussions about internationalization, higher education, modernity, coloniality, decoloniality, and my implications in the very problems I'm trying to solve when I deal with critical education, which is my research topic here in Brazil. By telling you this, I want to bring some of the challenges and complexities I faced when I decided to reflect upon my choices and desires to go abroad, right? And ultimately, to foster some space to gesture toward different futures to both higher education and internationalization. In terms of student mobility, my choice to go to Canada confirms the directional flows of international students to Western nations, mainly to countries that are in the global north. It is a fact that I, as a mixed-race Northeastern woman in Brazil, have been hyper-socialized into a colonial modern grammar that nurtured in me a desire for a certain type of knowledge, a certain type of recognition, and a certain type of success. So in Canada, I sought access to mainstream authors, books, and articles that are to be used to validate my ideas in the dissertation I hope to defend. There, I also had access to some modern promises of good housing, a green place to live in, beautiful parks, a diverse society, and a great university in which I could conduct my research. However, it was also in Canada where I saw Indigenous, Asian, and Latin American people being discriminated and exploited on different levels. There, I understood more deeply that for some people to have access to resources, many others will have to lack it. In Brazil, immigrant, Black, Indigenous, refugee, and foreign bodies have also been failed by our current economic, political, social, ecological, and relational system. So speaking from a racialized and gendered body in Brazil, I see myself occupying 3 positions at least. The first one being a position from where I recognize my desire of being part of and maintaining this colonial, modern, and violent space that is seen as the only viable way towards a more just and comfortable life, which is the university and schools in general. A second one being a position from where I see my privileged space inside a university, engaging in dialogue with both mainstream and other knowledge in an attempt to fight coloniality. And a third being a position from where I feel the need to identify my modern desires and how violent they are, and to invest in a different way of connecting, seeing, experiencing, and inhabiting the world I live in. So my readings and participation in academic and non-academic groups, such as Identidade de Leitura, Formação de Professores, the collective gesturing towards a decolonial future, the groups that discuss such things are very, very important, and they have been a space to dig deeper, to relate wider, and to connect the dots. Many things are still unintelligible to me and to my context, but I've been choosing to sit with the difficult and unsettling questions for which I have no quick answers, and I've also been choosing to try to imagine, at least, creative alternatives.
Thank you, Jhuliane, and thank you for agreeing to write with me. It was my pleasure. When we first discussed the vision for our article, the first draft of the title was Internationalization for the End of the World as We Know It, which was based on our understanding that the modes of existence that we currently inhabit are both inherently harmful and unsustainable, and thus we need to face the possibility of their end. In the context of numerous overlapping social and ecological crises, this seems to be, on the one hand, a logical place to explore. But we also recognize that many people, especially systemically advantaged people who are among the readers of our scholarly articles, will resist this possibility, as it would compel them to confront the end of a system that offers them many privileges and pleasures. Very few people are eager to confront this possibility, and even if they intellectually entertain it, so they go with us in the critique, it's very different to actually have them reorient their desires and investments toward, away from systemic continuity and towards something different. So we wanted to open up the possibility of a conversation about internationalization otherwise, something that was viable but unimaginable from within the system we currently have. But we felt that it was probably best to do this in a slightly less direct way. So we changed the title from Internationalization to the End of the World as We Know It, to Challenges and Complexities of Decolonizing Internationalization in a Time of Global Crises. Then COVID hit, and it already seemed like things had shifted. So more people were willing to have the conversation that we could only briefly introduce in the article. And this is a conversation about the ways that the modern promises of certainty, order, progress, infinite economic growth, social mobility, human exceptionalism, and unrestricted individual autonomy are subsidized by colonial processes of racialized and gendered extraction, exploitation, state violence, epistemicide, ecological destruction, and denial of accountability to all living beings, including the earth itself. So these conversations, they assume that COVID is not the crisis, but rather the warning shots of a much bigger storm that's brewing. This is a conversation about the fact that these modern promises are becoming increasingly untenable as we reach the limits of the planet, the limits of economic growth. And if this is the case, then we will need to decide, should we keep fighting to maintain or restore these promises, or should we begin to hospice them and create space for something new? So there are many ways of doing the former, of fighting to keep what we already have, although what might be slipping away. And we have those who are seeking what we might call system restoration. So some idea of past glory days of outright white supremacy and extraction exemplified by both the presidents of Brazil and the US, my home country. There are those who seek system adaptation. And these are people who see that there's a problem and they want to reform things, but they want to keep the underlying structure and even expand the promised benefits to more people. Then there are the people seeking systemic transformation, who seek a much deeper structural change based on redistribution and the development of alternatives that maintain some elements of the system we have. So for instance, people who say we need to replace capitalism with socialism. And finally, there are those who are interested in what we call system hospicing. This is the least recognized and the least intelligible possibility to address, but one that's interested in what it might mean to prepare for the end of the world as we know it. So rather than thinking about system reform, the emphasis here is on learning from the repeated mistakes of the current system, inviting disinvestment from its promises and creating space for other possibilities. The term hospicing indicates a recognition of this inevitable decline of the system we have, but a commitment to enable it to die with dignity rather than trying to either hasten its demise or keeping it on life support. And the other side of hospicing is, of course, welcoming the birth of something that comes after it without smothering it with our projections and expectations about what it could or should be. So in the paper, we review these possibilities and we consider what internationalization might look like from each of them. There isn't much space here or in the paper to actually do that in an extensive way. And so rather than try and rush that, what I'm going to do is offer just a few things to keep in mind for those who are interested in this hospicing approach, as it's generally the least engaged and the least elaborated upon in the literature and in our conversations in academia. So the first thing to keep in mind is that it's very difficult and even painful for people to sit with the possibility of systemic decline or collapse. Even when we see that we have a global pandemic, when we have forest fires around the world, rising political polarization, mass migration, and more. And this is because the current system, even if we know it's flawed, offers many delicious promises that are really hard to give up. So again, we can be intellectually convinced, but affectively, emotionally in denial about the fact that it's impossible for us to sustain this system, about the fact that our lives and livelihoods are subsidized by harm through this system, and that the problems we face are enormous and complex and probably can't be fixed with technical solutions or reform. The second thing to keep in mind is the fact that to face this possibility of systemic decline does not require that we acquire more information or develop a better plan for how we're going to address it. It rather requires developing the stamina and the intellectual, affective, and relational capacities to face the complexity, uncertainty, contradiction, and failures that are going to arise with sobriety, maturity, and responsibility, and without becoming overwhelmed or immobilized by the scope and scale of the problems we face. And this is not something, developing these capacities is probably not something we can learn in a book, and maybe not something we can even learn in the walls of our modern institutions, because it requires that we unnumb ourselves from other ways of knowing and being that we have exiled from ourselves, and that we decenter and de-universalize ourselves as universal knowers and Western knowledge as universally relevant. So as crises begin to escalate, I think that the challenge is how are we going to develop these capacities and these possibilities for something else to be possible? And it's going to be very difficult and uncomfortable. So I understand that most people are not interested, but if you are, there is a group of people who are trying to sit with this and trying to address it in responsible, sober ways. And we invite you to continue the conversation with us if that feels like something you're called to do.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Thank you very much, Jhuliane. It's wonderful to have you both here again. And as Sharon said, I think, Sharon, the fact that so many people wanted to have you here again, and that so many people are reading Jhuliane and your work here in Brazil means that we are willing to engage in this conversation. We are interested in seeing how we can let the system die in peace or with dignity, as you say. And even though we might not be able to see what this otherwise possibility is yet, I think that we are beginning to see different possibilities. In reference to Jhuliane's talk, and despite some local attempts we have to include displaced populations such as refugees and immigrants, like the one just presented by Fernanda, we have to admit that internationalization is still enacted through a lot of violence and exclusion, especially of this type of population. And so I think the time is more than ripe for us to think otherwise and as an otherwise possibility and outside the box. And we are very happy to have you here to present some, even if we don't have the answers, like Sharon and I were saying in the Abraling event, at least we are trying to ask the questions and we are open to make the question. And I think this is a step forward. It means we are moving. And so this is, I think, good news. So thank you very much for presenting us with this and the possibility to continue with this talk, which does not end here. And I'm going to ask now the next presenter, who is Gabriel Amorim. Gabriel has the difficult task now of presenting a paper on behalf of 4 other people. This paper was written by me, Sabrina Sembiante from the Florida Atlantic University, Gabriel and Thiago Veronez, who unfortunately could not be here. So Gabriel will have the daunting task of representing us all. So hope you do a very good job, Gabriel, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join you today. And thank you for putting the extra pressure, Kyria. So I'm here representing my colleagues who wrote this paper with me in a joint effort between these 2 institutions. And the title of our paper is Internationalizations in 2 Loci of Enunciation, the South and the Global North. And if we go to the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. So first of all, let us define our loci of enunciation so you will know, no, the previous one, the previous slide. Yes, the one before. The one with the map. Yes, that's the one. So first of all, let us define our loci of enunciation so you will know where we are departing from and attempting to build our local knowledges, as we were invited when we read the paper by Figueiredo and Martinez in 2019. So we are 4 researchers, 2 from the Global South, me and Kyria from the Federal University of Espírito Santo, located in the southeast of Brazil, and 2 from the Global North, Sabrina Sembiante and Thiago Veronez from Florida Atlantic University in the state of Florida in the United States. In the next slide, please. And our focus in this paper was to build local knowledge from an assumption that language policies and international cooperation agreements could be some windows of reflection for to build local knowledges about the internationalization of higher education. Okay, so in terms of language policies, in the next slide, please. The motivation to use language policies that we found in the literature for a possible window of reflection points, next slide, please. Yeah, that's the one. So it points to the relevance about languages to education, especially in terms of language for instruction, which triggers the debate, especially in multilingual settings, which UFES and FAO present. So we thought that could be a window for reflection. That should be one of our categories of analysis. And in terms of international cooperation agreements, so the next slide, please. Another evidence that we found in the literature was that cooperation agreements could be classified in as traditional international cooperation, what we call TIC, and horizontal international cooperation, what we're calling HIC. The first one being more based in a competitive relationship between the two partnering institutions and whose aim was simply to attract students. And the latter, the last one, the second, whose aim is based on solidarity and international awareness. And according to Morosini, this article from 2011, the process of the internationalization of higher education could be understood in terms of models of international agreements. So we thought this could be and should be another category of analysis. In the next slide, we start an analysis from UFES in terms of language policies. We found evidence in some of the studies that we had already carried out in our research group at UFES that language policies influenced UFES internationalization actions and plan. For example, one with the creation of the International Office with a division, a languages division, as a result of the role of the foreign language, with the English being the prominent one, especially because of the national programs like Science Without Borders and languages with English Without Borders first and Language Without Borders letters, and more recently Capsprint. English is also the chosen language of communication between the academic, the foreign academics at UFES, and Portuguese, which is the official academic, the official language in Brazil, is addressed peripherally in the language policies and actions at UFES, especially when it comes to the incoming foreign faculty and students in terms of the requirements they need to have to come to the institution. In the next slide, when we talk about international cooperation agreements, as you can see in this map, which is available at the institution's international office, most of UFES international cooperation agreements are oriented towards the global north, which is a reflex to meet the national government-funded programs like Capsprint, which directs 70% of its funds to institutions in the global north. This orientation had been already mentioned and confirmed in other studies like Amorim and Finardi in 2017, in which they analyzed UFES internationalization process in 3 levels: the macro level, the meso level, and the micro level. The macro level being the national levels, the national programs and policies, the meso level being the institutional policies and actions, and the micro level, which interested us the most for this study, which was the academic community opinion about the internationalization process at UFES. And the results of this study in terms of the micro, which interested us the most, was that the internationalization plan, the institutional internationalization plan at UFES was not concerned with the wants and needs of the academic community at large. In the next slide, from this analysis, we, like Sharon and Jhuliane, have some questions too. Some questions arise from UFES. Since our proposal in this study was to build local knowledges about the internationalization of higher education, this scenario that we found at UFES raised some questions like, how can we participate in government-funded internationalization calls and programs without losing sight of our wish for a more critical internationalization process in regards to language policy and international cooperation agreements? How can we move from TIC to HIC models of internationalization so we can be more horizontal and more sustainable? How can we foster critical thinking in relation to the internationalization process in our locus of enunciation? And more importantly, what kind of internationalization or internationalizations are we aiming for? In relation to FAO, the Florida Atlantic University, in the next slide, please. As it is in a privileged position in the global north, it is an English-speaking institution, and because of that, the institution enforces a policy demanding English proficiency tests from accredited agencies, mostly from the global north, and the international students whose first language is not English and that do not meet the language requirements, they may be conditionally admitted to FAO, but they have to take classes in the English language, intensive English institutes. And in terms of other languages, FAO only offers other languages to students majoring in French, Spanish, and Italian. In the next slide, in terms of its international cooperation agreements, in this map, we can see the current flow of students, this current flow of scholars to the institutions through the cooperation agreements that FAO currently has. The cooperation agreements, they have vary in purpose. The countries in red represent the countries that send students to study at FAO, and the countries in green represent the countries with which FAO has a mutual agreement to send and receive students and faculty members, for which, for example, the students receive credit when they take classes abroad. And also from FAO, some questions arise. So if we go to the next slide, please. Because of its privileged position, we think that it becomes especially challenging, but equally important to reflect on an institution locus of enunciation when it is in the privileged position of being part of the global north and reap the benefits of internationalization. So the questions that we find meaningful for FAO, some of them, there are many more in the paper. I was happy when Sharon and Jhuliane said they also had many provocative questions. I think when you read our paper, you will see a lot of provocative questions too, that we might not have the answers, but we're certainly looking for creative solutions for possible futures. So some of the questions are, how meaningful has internationalization at FAO been? What do we seek in internationalization policies at FAO? Is FAO ready to look critically at its privileged position and find ways to redesign and re-signify its internationalization plan? As a conclusion for our study, like I said, like Sharon and Jhuliane, when they said, I was happy when they said that, our paper offers lots of provocative but very important questions to help us think of some creative solutions for some possible futures, I think. So what can we take from this, or what should we take from all of this, from this analysis? So if we go to the next slide, we're looking at these two institutions, and regardless of the financial and geopolitical challenges that are currently in place, we are moving forward, the two institutions, in exploring the potential of internationalization for our institutions, FAO and UFES, because they are partner institutions, challenging the linguistic and geopolitical biases and privilege, and forging inroads for shifting from the traditional international cooperation agreements to more horizontal international cooperation agreements, so we can have a more sustainable partnership. And some of the questions that we leave in our paper for us to think of some possible futures are: why should we internationalize? Why should we assess and reflect about the internationalization process in our institutions? To whom is the institutional internationalization agenda going to serve or benefit? To what extent are we reinforcing an unequal relationship in terms of our internationalization plans and actions? Is our internationalization plan imposed in a top-down fashion? What are the possible avenues for a more critical internationalization process? I was happy when Sharon said that it's not that what we have, we don't have to create something new. What we have now is serving somebody. But the question that we leave in the end is, are we ready to walk the walk rather than talk the talk? Are we ready to get up and move? I think this pandemic, we addressed the pandemic, like Hans said in the beginning. We started writing the paper before the pandemic, and we finished it up, when the pandemic was going on. And we addressed it a little bit, and it helped us. I think it's helping us reflect and rethink a lot of things. But are we ready to get up and move and put things into practice? So, are we ready to walk the walk? Oh, Kyria is up, so my time is almost up. So, but I'm done. So on behalf of my colleagues, I'd like to thank you all for listening. I'm going to leave you with our contact information if you'd like to discuss with us anything from our paper, but I invite you to read. We go a little bit more deeper in the problematizations that I brought out here. So I invite you to take a look at our paper and the special issue, because I think this is going to help us rethink, redesign, resignify our possibilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gabriel. I think it was a wonderful, of course I'm suspicious, shouldn't say that, but it was a wonderful talk, and I think a wonderful exercise to write this paper with you and with our colleagues from FAO, reflecting about each other's locus of enunciation. And as we usually say in our research group, the questions are more interesting and more important than the answers. And I'd like to thank you, Gabriel, because you're responsible in our group to bring most of the challenging questions, the ones that make us think, and I really appreciate that. I think it's a wonderful contribution. I hope you can continue raising these questions, even though some of them are difficult, like I said, and we may not have the answers now, but it's still worth trying. So thank you very much.
There is also an answer to find.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. So thank you very much on behalf of Sabrina and Thiago too. And I'd like to call now our last guests. It's a group of 3 from all of them from UNISINOS, the authors who carried out an interview with Professor Jane Knight, and who will talk about that a little bit. So I'd like to welcome here Julieta Abba, Claudia de Souza, and Danilo from UNISINOS. Thank you very much for being here with us today. And the floor is yours.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you today to present the interview that is called Internationalization as a Process of Change, an interview with Gen 9. Before starting with the presentation, I would like to thank Kyria, Joyce, and Elizabeth for organizing this special issue and for creating this roundtable yesterday and today, and inviting us to discuss the assumptions, meanings, and impacts of internationalization. With that said, I would like to introduce myself. I'm Julieta Abba, and together with my colleagues, Claudia and Danilo, we did this interview with Professor Gen 9. I think that she needs no introduction. Most of you know her. She is one of the leading scholars in the field of internationalization. So the interview was conducted during the conference Shaping Sustainable Futures for Internationalization in Higher Education at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education of the University of Toronto in Canada. And in the opening keynote address, Professor Knight discussed the internationalization in higher education as it is currently evolving in Canada and around the world, and challenged us to consider the ways in which it could be sustainable, shaped into the future. Theories, policies, and practices of internationalization are spreading and transforming new ideas and approaches around the world. For this reason, she considers internationalization as a process of change. Well, our participation in this conference, where we met Professor Gen Knight, was promoted by the Center for International Studies in Education, Centro de Estudos Internacionais em Educação, of the graduate program in education of the UNISINOS University, located in the south of Brazil. This center was created in 2015 as a means for carrying out and supporting internationalization initiatives by the faculty and students, as well as creating conditions for the development of comparative and international studies in education. One of these initiatives that we are currently working on is the creation of the digital repository with bibliographic material on the internationalization of higher education, specifically in Latin America. Also, we have edited some books. Danilo will tell you about this later. And we also organize sessions, which we call international dialogues, with international professors and students who share their experience and research, among other activities organized by this center. So we are glad about the possibility of sharing the rich learning experience, and thanks Professor Gen Knight for the contribution at the conference and for taking the time to participate in this interview, in which she provides us with important insight for studies of internationalization in higher education. And now I give the floor to my colleague Claudia, who is going to comment on the main issues raised by Professor Gen Knight during the interview. Thank you.
I'm sorry, the microphone was mute. That's usual nowadays. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you very much for this opportunity to present some points of these interviews. And Kyria, Joyce, and Elizabeth, thank you very much for this. And I'd like to also to thank my colleague Julieta and Professor Danilo, who was my supervisor at the PhD during my PhD, and who gave me the reason to go to Canada during 6 months. And at that time, I could learn more and see, and well, this well, sometimes I forgot the words in English, but well, I could be more linked to the research that they do at UFSC, University of Toronto. I'd like to point some important things that are in this interview. The first of one is the definition of internationalization that Jane Knight gave us, and she advocates that the concept of internationalization is a process of change. And this is very important because we have to be aware of the changes of the world to understand that it's not only a kind of it's not fixed. We have to be aware of the changes and build a neutral concept of internationalization. And this is very important for her research, okay? The point two is that something that Professor Hans de Wit showed us in his presentation at the first, in this roundtable, that is that internationalization must respect the local context. It doesn't fit for all contexts. So one model or one pattern is not, it doesn't fit for every context. We have to be aware of the local context. And the point three is that the unintended outcomes of the internationalization process. She knows and she advocates that internationalization is not always or give us not always positive outcomes. So and we have to be aware of that to build a model or a pattern of internationalization that respects the institutional or the national level features of the countries and the institutions. And point four is that we have to worry about the international skills or international intercultural skills and global competencies that are important to develop in school-age children. Because internationalization, when it happens in the higher education level, it's very important, but people must, children must know about how to deal with intercultural competencies, the diversity, and this kind of skills that are very important for internationalization process. And the last point, but not the least, okay, is that internationalization needs more rigorous evidence-based research outcomes. She pleads about that, and she told us that it's very important to look for other themes that are interrelated to internationalization. For instance, and she is developing her research on this, on the role of international higher education, research, and innovation in strengthening relations between and among countries in order to address global challenges such as climate change, pandemics, food and water security, and others. So internationalization is in all of our diplomatic relations. So it's very important for us to discuss these relations and understand that it's not a static concept linked to higher education, but to other fields of research. Well, that's it. I'm very nervous because I'm not used to speaking English, so sometimes I feel very nervous. But I'd like to invite Professor Danilo that it's going to talk to you about the outcomes of this interview. Professor Danilo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, Kyria, and the organizers of this fantastic issue on internationalization of higher education. I will say some words about a book which is coming out in Portuguese, and which is the outcome of the meeting with Jay Knight and of the interview. Better, it is one of the outcomes. I'm glad to see that the journal is really is having a key role in building and strengthening connection amongst ourselves. So thank you for this opportunity. Well, I'll tell you something about the book we are publishing in Portuguese with text from Jay Knight. The title will be, in Portuguese, of course, Internationalization of Higher Education, Concepts, Tendencies, and Challenges. In Português, Internacionalização da Educação Superior, Conceitos, Tendências e Desafios. The important thing to say about the book is that when choosing the topics that would make up the content, it really turned out to be a book on introduction for studies in internationalization of higher education. Just going through some of the topics of the content, I'll mention some of them here. I guess it gives an idea of the range of the topics, and well, you know Jay Knight, and you know the depth with which she will deal with the topics. Like the first one would be internalization, concepts and frameworks. 3 generations of higher education, of internationalization, double degree programs, identity crisis, international universities, program and provider mobility, regionalization, knowledge diplomacy. So these are some of the topics which Jay Knight deals with in her book, which will be published in Brazil. The subtitle, the subtitles, I think they say a lot about the content also. It's about concepts such as internationalization. She gives us a broad perspectives on the way we deal or can or should deal with the issue of internationalization. There are also new concepts such as knowledge diplomacy, which is kind of not much discussed right now amongst ourselves. Jay Knight, with their experience, is also able to identify tendencies. For instance, mobility of students and academics in general to provider and program mobility. The issue of international universities. So these are really tendencies which she comes to grapple with in her text. And finally, challenges. Yeah, what do we want to do actually when we do internationalization? What do we need to do? And I think the book really gives us some very important insights of how to deal with the issue. It's interesting that she, in her introduction, dedicates the book to the next generation of Brazilians committed to advancing the internationalization of higher education. So I guess it's really an invitation for all of us to join in studies, research. She will be a companion in this process. So I guess that's it about the book. We will be glad to send you a copy. It will be published in ebook. We will also have printed copies. There will be no charge. It has been published with public funding. So if you contact us, we will be very glad to send you a copy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Danilo, Claudia, and Julieta. It is such a pleasure to see the faces of people we read for so long. One of these days, I was actually reading one of your papers with our research group, and I'm sure that they're attending, watching this, and they're thrilled to put faces to the surnames in the papers, and it is a great pleasure. And of course, we're looking forward to this book, Danilo, Claudia, Julieta, and I'm sure it'll be a great contribution to what we're doing. I'd like to, before I make a comment on this last talk, I would like to invite all the authors gradually to come back on stage. Because I would like to try and attempt to make general comments about each one of the talks, if you agree with me, and perhaps make one general comment question whereby all the authors can perhaps make an attempt, have a go, and making a comment. For example, I was... let me just check if we can have all the authors. Kefren, Joyce, podemos ter os autores todos agora, juntos? Thank you. So great to have everyone back here again. I was thinking, instead of asking one question for each one of the authors, I've been trying to summarize the questions and write some of them in the chat. And we'll make our best, as I told the wit who had to leave the room earlier, we'll make our best to send the comments and questions. Of course, with the limited time we have here, we won't be able to ask all the questions that were made in the chat and in the YouTube channel. But we are sure that this is only a start of a conversation. And we are looking forward to continue this conversation and this dialogue about internationalization. And so I was going to propose to you maybe to make a final reflection for each of us. For example, I can see that even though our special issue was made before the COVID pandemic, all of you at some point or in some way refer to it and refer to the changes that we've been going through as a result of what was happening. For instance, Hans de Wit mentioned, and we see that this is true especially for the Global South, that one of the greatest changes in internationalization has been the disruption caused in the academic mobility. And for countries in the Global South, which were not dependent on the academic mobility, perhaps this meant an opportunity. And we hope that this is an opportunity, like Sharon said, to rethink what we're doing, to think otherwise and not think of how we can maybe compete in the same scenario. We don't want to compete in the same scenario. We want something else. Maybe we don't know yet what it is, but I think, as most of you said with different words, there are many challenges, many opportunities. Fernanda Leal, for example, mentioned the outreach, a local initiative in that sense. Perhaps this is one way forward, with outreach and with populations that are excluded in other internationalization actions. Sharon and Jhuliane talked about other types of excluded populations that perhaps we can think of ways to include. Gabriel analyzed footprints or evidence in two different loci of enunciation, Global South and Global North. And so, in the end, Julieta, Claudia, and Danilo bringing in Jane Knight's review of the 25 years of concept of internationalization and restating, stressing that internationalization as a concept is changing, and it's always a process, not an end in itself. I think we can all agree on that. Perhaps my wish would be for you to have a final comment on, okay, we don't have all the answers, but what are some of the challenges or possibilities? What are some of, how can we summarize what we saw in this special issue? What are the points in which we can diverge or converge? And so I would ask each one of you to have a final go at it. Perhaps we can do this in the sequence of the presentations, just so as to be fair. And so I would perhaps invite Fernanda Leal to go first. And then after that, Sharon, Jhuliane, Gabriel, Julieta, Claudia, and Danilo. What do you say?
Sure. Thanks, Kyria. So I learned a lot today, and thinking of all the presentations and thoughts that were brought together, I was thinking of something that Portuguese sociologist Souza Santos wrote recently, saying that this pandemic, this time of crisis, only demonstrates the fragilities of our institutions. And I think this is very clear in the case of higher education and higher education institutions. So what we see is that our institutions have been historically attached to colonial patterns that have pretty much contributed to unequal geographies of power, of knowledge, and of being. So internationalization is also immersed in that very same paradigm. And I believe that everything that we were facing is an opportunity to revisit how we can actually change those patterns that we have and that we're still contributing to exist.
Thank you, Fernanda. Sharon and Jhuliane?
Jhuliane, you go
first.
Okay, I can say some words. I think from the texts, right, that we read and discussed here, one thing that comes to my mind is that there are many possibilities and many perspectives on internationalization, right? And we must reflect on the issues that they all show. For example, why should we internationalize, right? Which or what is my context? So we must read our context. We must read the universities and the situations we are part of, and maybe not only think about include the people who are not included, right? But the system itself and the exclusions they are promoting, are they really viable to be continued like this, right? So I think Sharon can help me here, that just to think and to rethink, if internationalization is so important to us in our context nowadays, why is that so? And how should we, for example, see and act within our universities? How should we enter these spaces, use the money or not? Today, what should we do today? What should we do tomorrow? Is the situation the same or not?
the sound, Sharon. I think your mic is muted.
Sorry.
There you go.
I thought I had. Thank you, Jhuliane. I have the sense sometimes when I receive email requests from potential doctoral students, if I say yes to come study with me, am I selling a ticket to the Titanic? Like, sometimes it feels like a sinking ship, academia and the whole thing. And I think, you know, I'm as a self-absorbed American, I'm really thinking also about the election that's coming up and the powder keg of violence and even possible civil war in the U.S. context. And it's like, what does that have to do with internationalization? I'm not sure, but I think they are related. And I think this question of the need to prepare ourselves as much as possible for what might come. And I can't stress enough that I think our intellectual critiques are super important, but I also think we really see where people are at when we have the crisis. And it's not possible to necessarily predict that, but I'm just inviting us to sit in that space of asking, you know, how did we get to this point? You know, how can we live differently together, or if it comes to it, die differently together, because that is also a possibility. And it's not just in the US. I know that there's increasing and intensified violence in Brazil, especially against Black and Indigenous people. And it seems that it might only get worse. And then what is our role, as Jhuliane said, as people in these institutions occupying these spaces? And I think it's not for me to preserve the institution for its own sake, but to see what kind of resources and conversations and pedagogies and relationships we can mobilize from this space in order to face potentially, extreme violence beyond what we already are seeing. So not to end on a note like that, but I can't help but do it. So there it is.
I totally understand that, and to refer to what Fernanda said in the beginning about Boaventura de Souza Santos' forecast with the cruel lesson of the pandemic with his book that was launched after the COVID. And you mentioned that we're doing this, and this is happening in Brazil as well. And I may say, Sharon, not only with people, not only with Black people and Indigenous people. Look at what is happening with the animals, with the fires that are, you know, destroying the nature. And so I totally agree. And I think that something that we all agree here is that if we don't learn how to interact with each other and with our planet, with the environment, and by environment, I mean all the beings, not only us, in a different way, this is going to be difficult. And I think that internationalization, you asked, Sharon, what is the connection between elections and the internationalization? Well, everything is connected. Until we understand that everything is connected, we are all connected. And while everything we do touches and affects each other, then I don't see a solution. But let's see what Gabriel has to say. Gabriel is talking from the Global South, but is somebody who had the experience of living also in the Global North, somebody, you know, in these two places. So what do you think, Gabriel?
I was thinking here when you said challenges and possibilities, I'll try to address both. I think what we put in the presentation, I think the challenge is to walk the walk, right? And I refer to that study that we carried out in 2017. Actually, it was from 2015. We published it in 2017. We had over 1,600 responses from the academic community, and they all said, the majority said, that they were not, they didn't feel that internationalization was for them. And I think, you know, the big question that we posed in the presentation and in the paper is, what kind of internationalization are we aiming for? So Sharon said something very interesting in her presentation. So I think, and I'll take that, I think the challenge is for us to address that question, maybe seriously leave our delicious comfort zone, and the possibility now that's opened up for us, and also a challenge, is to self-assess. You know, the institutions need to do a self-assessment and respond that question, to answer that question. What kind of internationalization are we aiming for? You know, are we aiming for an internationalization that's for the whole academic community? Is it, you know, because we saw that the programs, when they mentioned a lot of the mobility programs, because they connected internationalization with mobility, but that was not for everybody. That was just for the STEM courses. So the people from the humanities were neglected. So I think it's time to turn back home, you know, come back home and self-assess. And I think those questions that we posed in the paper kind of help them to look at the present situation and towards the future too. But it is a challenge, but also a possibility.
Yeah. And mind you,
like possibilities too.
Yes, and mind you, like Gabriel said, go back home or turn back home, remembering that home is the planet. And again, this means looking at the planet and our relationship with each other and the planet in a different way. And I think this is a perfect way to link to the last group, Danilo, Claudia, and Julieta, because you mentioned that one of the most important questions in what we're doing and in the studies about internationalization, and I think everyone here agrees on that and mentioned this with different words, is why should we do it anyway? So the first question is why? And what do you say? Should we?
For sure. Julieta, would you like to talk first? Go ahead.
No, thank you. Go ahead, you.
No, thank you. Well, I think that COVID, if you don't mind, I can talk after me. If you'd like to put some your comments, feel free about that. Well, I think that COVID brings us the need of looking differently for everything. So when I looked to the interview with Jane Knight nowadays, sometimes it seems to me decontextualized, because nowadays we have COVID. We are not talking about concepts or important points, or no, we are talking about everything that. And I think that we can change, yes. And I read an article, if I'm not wrong, or a book, I cannot remember now, from the VIT that talked about the different perspectives of internationalization and the emerging voices and worlds. And nowadays it's not only voices, but also different ways of interacting with concepts that were very internalized for us. For instance, well, we can share screens and talk to other people, and so on. This is not the problem. But one of the most richest thing in the mobility or a process or internationalization process is what you live abroad. Different cultures, different experiences, different food. You live this in every minute you are abroad. So how do you bring this experience to I don't remember the word, but I will try in Portuguese. You can help me, Kyria, please. How do you How do you amplify this in your experience? And I think this is a problem this is a problem to understand how people live, to understand the diversity, if I could be myself understood. But I think this is the challenge. Okay, we have to find possibilities and to maybe that's the new normal. Okay, we don't have more geographical boundaries. Okay, we have one planet, but we have to share things. And I don't know if from this moment on we can do it the way we know. But this is learning. This is life. We have to learn.
Yeah. I was just going to mention before Julieta and Danilo take the floor that I think that Fernanda's example of the outreach activity with the displaced populations, refugees and immigrants, it's an excellent way to bring this home. Maybe this experience does not have to be abroad. We can have this experience with different cultures, different customs here. But maybe we haven't done that because we were not interested in those people. We were interested in the 1% of international students of certain areas that counted. Those 99% of the students from other areas or non-students and this kind of populations were usually neglected by institutions. And so
invisible. I don't know, invisibilized. That's it.
Exactly. Thank you, Claudia.
Well, I think that this pandemic bring us a possibility to think other forms to internationalize. And my wish would be that these forms also develop from a critical perspective and not from a hegemonic perspective as it has been until now. This is my wish.
I think we can all agree on that. And we hope, Danilo, the book is going to give us some hints, some footsteps.
I wish I could. But I would like to maybe raise two issues here, which COVID-19 is bringing up for me very strongly. The first one, I would call it the paradox of connection. Paradox of connection. So we have this wonderful opportunity to be connected virtually with Canada, United States, Espírito Santo, and whatever. And we could have Africa, Asia with us here. So it's a wonderful opportunity. But I think also this same experience makes us eager to experience other ways of connecting. Yeah. So I guess we are all eager to embrace each other, to say hello, to have a coffee together, and maybe even hopefully to relate in other ways with everyone, every culture, and with nature, and so with all the things and people that are. Okay, so I think this, I would call it the paradox of connection today. The second one, I think the discussion of internationalization challenges the classical idea of citizenship. It came up in some occasions here in the discussion.
Yeah.
And so the classical idea of citizenship restricted to the nation state. Yeah. So I think COVID-19 is showing how the borders of inequality, of climate change, and whatever, all the planetary problems, they really don't have borders, which kind of are connected to the nation, to the states as we have them today, states and regions. So I think it's really an opportunity to think of social organizations in other ways. Yeah, it's a relation with, as I mentioned before, with nature, with everybody, but also in terms of social organization. I think it shows the limits of the structures we have, that we need to at least to try to move to other forms of organizing our lives on this planet. So this would be some ideas coming up from the discussion and from your question.
Thank you very much, Danilo. Thank you, Danilo, very much. And I think that in terms of this challenging or questioning of citizenship, even the concept of global citizenship, which is questionable today, I think, again, it leaves us in this tension. And perhaps this is what brings us together talking about internationalization, the tension between local and global, because whereas we acknowledge that there are global human values and rights which should be entitled and guaranteed to everyone, we know that depending on the region where somebody is, these rights and benefits and values are going to be more or less defended, more or less guaranteed. So how do we draw the line? Boaventura de Souza Santos, for example, in this book that I mentioned, The Cruel Pedagogy of the Virus, he suggests the creation of a supranational government, in the sense that things that are universal, and by universal I mean should be guaranteed to everyone, not universal in the Western university model. They should not be at some point, they could not be challenged or jeopardized by national governments. But then this is utopic in a way, because though we recognize this, when we have problems, who do we complain to? Who do we charge? How can we deal with this at a national, regional, local, global level? And of course, if the pandemic has shown us and taught us anything, is that everything global and the global and the local are connected. And this is why I think when Sharon asked, but what is the connection between internationalization? I think this is the connection. It is a realization that everything we do has local and global consequences and impacts. And if we do not acknowledge that, and if we do not learn how to act responsibly and sustainably, both at a local and at a global level, I think we will continue to have, problems as we had in the pandemic. So I'd like to thank you very much, because though we are finishing this debate with the somber realization that we are yet very far from where we would like to be, I deeply acknowledge and thank you for the contribution you are doing in the sense of raising these questions. And I think that connecting the talks we had today and the talks we had yesterday, we can see that though it is very small, it's a grain of sand in the ocean, it is our grain of sand. It is something that we have done. So I really would like, in the name, on behalf of Joyce and Betty, I would like to thank you all for your contribution and invite you to continue this debate in other channels and ways. So again, thank you very much. And I would like to invite Joyce and Betty. I don't know if they can go back in. I'd like to ask the two organizers, Joyce and Betty, to have a final word and perhaps talk a little bit about the organization of this special issue and this event. And like we said in the beginning, this was perhaps a product of the COVID as well, because if it hadn't been for the pandemic, perhaps we wouldn't have been able to have this event virtually. So though we can see many challenges, there are opportunities too.
That's right. Yes, I agree. Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that. Yeah.
Joyce?
Eu vou quebrar o protocolo, vou falar em português, tá? Eu gostaria de agradecer, em especial a professora Beth e a professora Kyria, que participaram comigo da organização do dossiê, e esse dossiê que foi publicado na ETD é que resultou nessas 2 dias de lives, né, dessas rodas de conversas maravilhosas, e que eu agradeço imensamente aos autores, aos expositores, primeiro pela participação no dossiê e depois por gentilmente aceitarem participar desses 2 dias, né? Ontem nós tivemos o primeiro dia em português com os autores nacionais, hoje o segundo dia em inglês com os autores estrangeiros e também as parcerias nacionais. Eu agradeço também aos editores da ETD, em especial o professor Antônio Carlos e a professora Camila, por toda a atenção durante todo o processo. Agradeço especialmente também a nossa equipe técnica, sem ela as lives não seriam possíveis, então devo nomear o Kefren, a Ana Paula e a Asenate, que estiveram conosco nesses 2 dias nos auxiliando. A gente teve alguns problemas com questão de internet e a gente pede desculpas por isso. A ideia é posteriormente legendar os 2 vídeos, o de ontem para inglês e o de hoje para português, para que um número maior de pessoas tenha acesso. É uma forma também de democratizar o conhecimento. Então, e outra coisa que eu gostaria de incluir também é que todo esse trabalho, ele partiu inicialmente de uma ideia muito pequenininha, que foi com a minha entrada no pós-doc aqui na UFES, na Universidade Federal do Espírito Santo. Dentro das ações do meu projeto de pós-doc, uma delas é da produção de um dossiê, e aí resultou nesse dossiê tão lindo, né? Não tinha a ideia de que seria um trabalho tão especial como foi, e desse dossiê saiu, então, a ideia das lives, dessas rodas, para que a gente pudesse socializar de mais uma forma, além da escrita, esse trabalho. Então, agradeço todo mundo, agradeço a Elisa, que é a minha supervisora de pós-doc e contribuiu nesse trabalho, agradeço ao PPGE, UFES, a toda a equipe, a FAPES, CAPES, pelo auxílio financeiro, enfim, só tenho a agradecer. Muito obrigada. Thank you.
Thank you. I also would like to thank you, everyone, the great talks today, the great words that everyone brought to us. And I think from that, and I really hope that we can change the ways the world, are doing the internationalization. I'm sure that the talks today I really liked for that. And for that, I am very and deeply thank you for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beth. Thank you very much, Joyce. And I just would like to thank both of you, but especially Joyce, who, you know, as just said in Portuguese, started this project, had the idea, and carried out this postdoc project at PPG, which was brilliantly originated the organization of the special issue, and also this socialization in the live section. With the help and the support of all the authors who brilliantly, like Abba said, helped us to put the first stone in these footsteps towards a different form, or like Sharon says, an otherwise way of internationalization. So thank you very much. I invite you to join the group JAPIS to continue this debate and conversation, which is only starting here. And perhaps we can think of a different and more talks through the group. So thank you very much.
Goodbye, Paul.
Bye.